Arizona Territory, 1879. The first thing Franklin O'Malley noticed when his boot hit the dust outside that nameless saloon was the smell of stale beer, sweat, and something else. Something wrong. He had ridden nearly 2 days straight, crossing the sunburnt ridges west of Tombstone, chasing rumors of a stolen mare and a man who swindled him out of $60 worth of silver bits. But it was not the thief he found. It was her. She was chained behind the saloon like a forgotten animal. He saw her by accident, just a flick of movement behind the cracked boards as he stepped around the back for water. Her wrists were bound to a rusted iron ring drilled into the stone wall. Her dress was torn at the sleeves, sun-bleached and stiff with dust. Her face lifted at the sound of his boots, and for a second he thought she might be a ghost, but her eyes, sharp and burning, were very much alive. "Do not come closer," she said, voice dry as the desert. Frank stopped, hands raised. "I will not hurt you." She studied him, jaw tight. "They all say that. I am not like them." "Then ride on. I am not leaving you here." She did not answer, but her chin trembled. Frank stepped closer, slow as dusk. The chain was looped through a leather cuff at her wrist, locked tight. Her skin was bruised purple beneath it. "Who did this?" She looked away. "The men who run this place. One of them bought me in Texas, said he was taking me to Prescott to work in a hotel, sold me instead." Frank's throat burned. She looked up at him again, her voice low. "You going to fight 5 men for a woman you never met?" Frank leaned in and pulled a folded knife from his boot. "No, I am going to kill 5 men for you." Her eyes widened slightly, then narrowed with something like hope. "My name is Franklin O'Malley," he said, cutting the leather loop. "What is yours?" She hesitated as the chain clattered free. Solene Hart." He caught her as she stumbled forward on stiff legs. She was light, but her body trembled with weight, fear, hunger, exhaustion. He eased her down to sit on an overturned barrel. "Can you ride?" "I do not know," she whispered. "We will find out." Frank turned toward the open desert. "We leave now." "I cannot," she said. "They will come after me." "I will shoot them if they do." Her eyes met his. "Why are you doing this?" Frank looked at her for a long moment. "Because no one else did." He led her to his horse, a red roan named Judah. Solene's hands shook as she climbed up behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, tight and desperate. She did not speak as they rode, and neither did he. The saloon shrank behind them, swallowed by the heat mirage. They stopped just after dusk, deep in the hills. Frank made a fire in a dry creek hidden from view. He handed her a tin cup of water, watching as she drank like a woman starved of mercy. Afterward, she sat beside him, arms folded around herself. "They kept me chained for 4 weeks," she said. "Fed me twice a day, told the girls inside I had the fever. I tried to chew through the strap the first night. That earned me a broken rib." Frank looked at her, his jaw clenched. "What were you before all that?" Solene looked at the fire. "A dressmaker in San Antonio. My father died last winter. My mother passed when I was 13. I took the job offer because I was tired of fighting alone." "You are not alone now," he said. She turned her head, watching him. "Why did you really stop back there?" Frank shrugged. "I was chasing a man who stole from me. Thought he might be in that saloon." "Did you find him?" "No, but I found something else." Her eyes flickered to the fire, then back to him. "You do not even know me." "I know enough." She was quiet after that, but she did not move away when he laid his coat around her shoulders. They rode north for 2 days, avoiding trails and towns. Solene's bruises faded from black to yellow. Her voice returned, and with it a soft humor. She laughed once when Frank tripped over his own boot trying to cook beans. By the 3rd morning, she asked, "Do you have family?" Frank hesitated. "Not anymore. My wife died giving birth 6 years ago. The baby too. I never remarried." Solene looked down. "I am sorry," he nodded. "It was a long time ago." They camped near a shallow creek that night. Solene helped gather kindling while Frank tied Judah to a cottonwood tree. The light was golden, soft on her face. "You are different than I thought," she said. "How is that?" "I thought you were just another man with a gun." "I am," he said, "but I use mine for the right reasons." She smiled a little at that. Later, as the fire crackled low, she reached for his hand. "You saved my life, Franklin O'Malley." He looked at her, his voice steady. "You are not just something I rescued. You are someone I want to know." Solene did not answer right away. Then she leaned forward, pressed her forehead to his. I want to know you too. They fell asleep beside the fire, their fingers still intertwined, and the next morning, as the desert wind rose over the hills, Solene Hart looked at Frank with something deeper than gratitude, something that felt like the beginning of love. They reached the southern edge of the Mogollon Rim by late afternoon. The air thinned there, trees rising in dark clusters of ponderosa, and the sun dipped slower behind the ridges. Franklin guided Judah off the main trail, following a dry wash that snaked into a pine grove where he used to camp during silver runs. Solene dismounted stiffly. Her legs had begun to find their strength again, but she still moved like someone learning her shape anew. She didn't complain, though. Not once. She gave a small nod when he handed her a waterskin and crouched to drink, her eyes darting over the unfamiliar land. "Is this where you plan to go?" she asked, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "No," Frank said, "but it's where we ought to be for now." "There's a logging camp a few miles northeast, mostly Basque and Irish workers. Good folks, I'm known there." She stood slowly, brushing pine needles from her skirt. "You think they'll ask questions? Maybe. But I'll answer them." Frank unpacked a small canvas roll and began setting up the lean-to. Solene watched for a moment, then stepped forward and took a corner to help. They didn't speak while they worked. The quiet between them felt settled now, not heavy. When the canvas was secure, she sat near the fire ring and began stacking stones without being asked. Frank noticed the way she avoided the flames, keeping a careful distance even when she reached to set the kindling. "You ever seen these highlands before?" he asked. She shook her head. "Closest I ever got to trees was a pecan grove behind my aunt's house." Then, after a pause, "I didn't know Arizona had green places. Most folks don't. All they see is the scrub and the dust." She looked up at the sky, which was turning lavender. "I used to picture places like this when I was a girl. Thought maybe one day I'd live somewhere with snow and tall trees, but I also thought I'd marry a man who stitched boots, and that never happened either." Frank smiled faintly, tossing a few dry twigs into the pit. "You still want snow and tall trees," she tilted her head, considering. "I want anything that doesn't come with a lock and a chain." Frank didn't answer. He stood, lit the kindling with a flint, and let the fire build in soft cracks and blinks. Later, when the meal was just beans and leftover cornbread, she said, "You ever think about leaving Arizona?" "Once," he said. "After my brother died. He was a rancher near Camp Verde, took a bullet from a drunk in a land dispute. I buried him myself, thought about heading east after that." "But the land here holds you," she nodded slowly. "I think I understand that now, even with what happened. I'd rather bury the past here than run from it." A wind picked up through the trees, and she drew her shawl tighter around her. Frank stood and walked toward his saddlebag. He returned with a folded shirt and offered it to her. "It's clean," he said. "Worn but warm." She accepted it without hesitation, running her fingers over the seams. "Thank you." He sat across from her, knees drawn up, hat resting beside him. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the shadows beneath her collarbone. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause. "It ain't safe for you to travel under your name. If they come looking, they'll ask for Solene Hart." Her expression didn't change, but her eyes grew still. "Then what do you suggest?" "There's a way to change it. Properly, not forged, not hidden." She didn't blink. "You mean marriage?" Frank nodded once. She lowered her gaze, then looked up slowly. "You offering, Franklin?" "I am, not out of pity. No, not because you feel you owe me something. I don't owe you, I want to give." She folded the shirt over her knee, then looked directly at him. "I don't want to be anyone's burden." "You wouldn't be," she exhaled, long and even. "If I agree, it won't be for shelter. It'll be because I believe in what we could build." "I wouldn't ask for it any other way." They sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't need filling. The fire snapped between them, and above, the stars came out slow and steady. After a while, she stood and moved to sit beside him, not across from him, beside. Her shoulder brushed his, and she didn't pull away. "I won't decide tonight," she said, "but I'll sleep easier knowing you asked." He nodded, his voice low. "I'll wait as long as you need." Her fingers found his, tentative but certain, and in that quiet stretch of pine and dark sky, the wound between them began to mend into something whole. At first light, the world was blue and quiet. A thin frost clung to the pine needles, and the heavy hush of the high country pressed close. Solene emerged from the lean-to wrapped in Franklin's shirt, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. She moved with more steadiness than the day before, though her steps still favored her left side. Frank was crouched near the coals, scraping ash from the skillet with the edge of a buck knife. He looked up when he heard her, but said nothing. "I didn't expect it to be so cold," she said, tugging the sleeves tighter around her hands. "Elevation does that," he replied, tilting his head toward the eastern tree line. "Sun won't reach us for another hour." She sat beside the fire ring and watched him work. The silence between them had shifted again, no longer shell-shocked or cautious, but something beginning to root. He handed her a strip of dried meat and a square of bread from his saddlebag. "You always carry this much food." "Only when I plan to be alone a while." Her eyes followed a woodpecker tapping high above them. "If we go to that camp you mentioned, what then?" "I'll speak to the foreman. There's a woman there who takes in laundry from the men, sometimes mends their shirts, might be room for help." "And you?" "I'll stay close, cut beams or haul freight into town, nothing permanent." She considered that. "You trust them?" "I trust they won't ask questions unless I give them reason to." Solene chewed slowly, her gaze drifting toward the edge of the camp. "I never made a habit of asking for help." "You didn't ask," he said. "I offered." She looked at him then, long enough he felt it deep in his chest. "I never said yes." "I know." The moment lingered between them. She broke it first, brushing crumbs from her lap. "You ever live with anyone after your wife passed?" "No." "Why not?" Frank hesitated. It stopped feeling right, the idea of starting over, until now. She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased ever so slightly. By midday, they packed their things and headed northeast. The trail narrowed, flanked by aspen and manzanita, and they rode single file. Solene kept her eyes ahead, her hands steady on the horn of the saddle. The wind carried the scent of resin and distant wood smoke. Near a bend in the trail, they passed a scatter of elk tracks pressed into the thawing dirt. Frank slowed Judah and pointed toward a broken patch of brush. "Someone's been through here with a cart," he said. "Not more than 2 days gone. Bandits." "No, iron wheels, probably hauling lumber." They pressed on until the trees opened into a clearing and the sound of axes and saws echoed ahead. The camp was rough, a ring of canvas tents around a central shed, with smoke curling from a stone chimney. Men moved between stacks of cut timber, some shirtless despite the chill. Frank dismounted and helped Solene down without a word. She steadied herself against his arm, then stepped forward on her own. A man with a thick beard and a wide stance approached them, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "Frank O'Malley," he said, squinting. "Didn't expect to see you again." "Didn't plan to come back," Frank replied. "Things changed." The bearded man looked at Solene, then back to Frank. "She with you?" "She is." The man gave a single nod. "You looking for work?" "Something short-term, and a safe corner for her to sleep." The man jerked his chin toward a smaller tent near the edge of the clearing. "You can set up there. Ms. Calder's still here. Could use help with the wash." Frank thanked him, then led Solene toward the tent, its canvas patched with thick thread and lined with cedar branches at its base. Inside, it smelled of wool and dried herbs. She sat on a low cot, running her fingers over the worn blanket. "You weren't lying. They don't ask much. They figure every man's got a story, they just don't want to hear it." She looked up at him. "What if I said yes to marrying me?" "Yes. I'd take you to the circuit judge in Pine. He's honest and he won't care what name you give. We could be wed by midweek." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "And after, I'd build us a place you could call your own. Not much, just sound walls and a roof that don't leak. You'd have your say in everything. Paint the door red if you wanted." She laughed softly. "I never thought about the color of a door before." "Then it's time you did." She stood slowly, her feet bare against the packed dirt floor. "I want to choose this. Not because it's the only path forward, but because it's the one that feels right." Frank's voice was quiet. "Then choose it." She stepped to him and placed her palm flat against his chest. "I do." He didn't kiss her, not yet. He just rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm between them. Outside, the saws kept on their rhythm, but inside that tent, the world held still. Neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The promise had been made, and in the silence that followed, it settled deep in both of them, solid as stone, quiet as snowfall. The judge's cabin stood at the edge of pine, tucked behind a thicket of spruce and scrub oak, its porch sagging under the weight of wet spring air. The ride from the logging camp had taken half the day, and Solene's hands stayed wrapped in the folds of her shawl the whole way. Not from cold, but something quieter, Frank dismounted first and tied Judah to the rail. Then he turned to lift her down, his touch careful, not for weakness but for reverence. She stepped to the ground and looked up at the cabin's crooked chimney, smoke curling in a thin thread into the gray sky. "Does he know we're coming?" she asked. "He owes me a favor," Frank said. "I told him we'd arrive by supper." She nodded once, then walked ahead of him up the porch steps. The door opened before they could knock. Judge Halworth was a lean man, older than most trees in the territory, with a voice like gravel and a gaze that missed nothing. He wore a black coat that didn't quite fit and had a leather Bible tucked under one arm. "O'Malley," he said, stepping aside. "And the lady, Solene Hart," she said, her voice even. The judge studied her for a beat longer than most would have found comfortable, but his tone stayed neutral. "You both understand what you're asking." "We do," Frank said. "Then come in." The room smelled of ink, tobacco, and dry paper. A writing desk stood in the corner, cluttered with ledgers. On the wall hung a map of the territory, yellowed at the edges. Halworth motioned for them to sit at the table while he flipped open a thick register. "I'll need your full names, birthplaces, and the date you wish this union to be recognized," he said. They gave them. Solene's voice didn't shake. When the judge asked if either had been wed before, Frank said yes once. Solene said no. Halworth didn't comment. He just recorded it all in the ledger with slow, deliberate strokes. "You'll need a witness," he said, setting down the pen. "My housekeeper will do." He stepped into the back room, and a moment later, a young woman with ash-blonde hair and a flour-dusted apron entered. She looked at Solene with open curiosity, then stood quietly by the stove. The ceremony was quick. The judge's words were plain and without flourish, the kind used for cattlemen and schoolteachers alike. When he asked if they took each other in marriage, Solene didn't hesitate. "I do." Frank repeated the same, steady and clear. When the final words were spoken and the ledger signed, Halworth closed the book with a soft thud. "You're husband and wife now," he said. "I suggest you make the name known in town before someone else does it for you." Solene turned to Frank. "What name did you give him?" "O'Malley," he said. "I gave you mine." She drew in a breath, not startled, not uncertain, just quietly moved. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the porch shingles. Frank wrapped her shawl tighter as they stepped out into the dusk. They didn't return to the camp. Instead, they followed a narrow trail east, deeper into the pines, to a cabin Frank had built years before, meant for a life that never came. He hadn't touched it in more than a season, but the roof still held and the hearth still stood. Solene stepped inside first, her boots on the plank floor sounding like a claim. The place smelled of cedar and dust. A single iron bed, a stone fireplace, shelves that waited patiently for use. She moved through the space without speaking, running her fingers along the edge of the table, then stopping at the window to look out at the trees. Frank set down the saddlebags and lit a lamp. The warm glow reached across the room and caught her face in profile. "I didn't expect it to feel like this," she said. "Like what?" "Like coming home to something I never had." Frank crossed to her and rested his hand on the small of her back. "It's yours now." She turned to him, and for the first time she reached up on her own and drew him close. They kissed there, not desperate or hurried, but with the quiet certainty of people who'd already chosen one another. That night they unpacked slowly. She placed a comb on the shelf above the basin. He folded his spare shirt over the chair. They cooked beans and ate them by the fire, knees touching. When the wind howled through the trees later, she didn't flinch. She lay beside him under a patched quilt, eyes open to the dark. "You think they'll come looking?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "But they won't find you." She rolled toward him, her hand resting over his heart. "They'd be fools to try." Frank didn't speak. He just reached for her hand and held it there where her touch felt like something long buried and finally found. Outside, the last of the snow melted from the branches. Inside, she slept with his name wrapped around her like a promise. Frank rose early. The air smelled of damp bark and thawing earth, and the first light slanted low through the pine limbs. He stepped outside in his boots and shirt sleeves, the cold brushing his skin like an old warning. A pair of jays argued in the branches above, their cries sharp against the hush. He chopped wood until his arms ached, stopping only when the sun cleared the ridge inside. Solene stirred. She'd taken to making the bed each morning with the same quiet care she'd once given her stitches and hems. She folded the quilt, not with habit, but with intention. When she stepped outside to where Frank was stacking the last of the firewood, she carried a wool scarf in her hands. "You'll catch chill," she said, wrapping it around his neck before he could reply. He touched her wrist lightly. "You always this bossy, only when I've got something worth keeping warm." Frank kissed her then, slow and without rush. When he pulled back, her cheeks flushed, not from the cold. They traded long days for steady ones. Solene took up mending for the camp hands after word spread that her stitches held better than factory seams. The men left their shirts wrapped in oilcloth, payment tucked inside with tobacco or dried apples. She kept the coins in a tin under the floorboard and the rest in a jar on the shelf, labeled in her neat hand. Frank worked hauling beams from the upper ridge down to the saw shed. He came home with pine pitch in his hair and hands raw from rope burn. He never complained. At night, they sat by the fire, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. She read aloud from a second-hand book he'd traded for in town, a collection of travel journals from a Missouri circuit rider. Neither of them cared much for the words, but the sound of her voice filled the room like music. One evening, she set the book aside and watched the fire with a far-off look. "I used to believe I'd never be safe again," she said. "Even after you found me, it took time more than I thought it would." Frank didn't interrupt. He waited. "I kept waiting for it to be taken away," she continued. "But every day it stays. You stay. That's what's changed. You could have left any time. I didn't want to." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. "I won't ever give you cause to," he said. Spring came early that year. The creeks swelled with snowmelt, and wild lupine bloomed along the edges of the trail. Solene began planting herbs in a cleared patch near the cabin: parsley, horehound, a few sprigs of mint. She bartered with a ranch woman north of the ridge for onion bulbs and a sack of flour. When she made stew thick with root vegetables and wild garlic, Frank leaned back in his chair and said, "I've eaten worse in saloons that cost me a week's wage." She narrowed her eyes. "That better be a compliment," he grinned. "It's a promise I'm never eating anywhere else." That night, he pulled a narrow box from beneath the bed. Inside was a ring simple, a thin band of silver with a carved line etched across the center. He turned it in his fingers, then looked at her where she sat brushing her hair by the window. "I know we're married by law," he said, "but I'd like you to have this if you want it." She looked at the ring, then at him. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." She held out her hand. He slid it onto her finger and she closed her hand around his. "I'll never take it off," she said. That summer the forest dried and the days grew longer. They built a small shed for firewood, and Frank added a second window to the cabin, framing it so Solene could see the garden from the table. She painted the door pale blue. One morning she stepped out into the porch light with her hand resting low on her belly. She didn't say anything at first, but her eyes had a quiet brightness. Frank put down his saw. She nodded. He crossed the yard in 2 strides and wrapped her in his arms. They didn't speak of what came before, not that day. Not again, but it lingered in the way he touched her with reverence, and the way she leaned into him like she belonged there. Autumn arrived with gold leaves and cooler nights. Frank lined the inside walls with wool scraps to keep the heat in. Solene stitched small shirts from leftover cloth, humming under her breath, her movements slower but careful as ever. They walked together most evenings, her hand tucked into his as they followed the edge of the timberline. He always kept a blanket in his pack in case she tired. On the night the first frost settled, she went still beside the fire and gripped his arm. By morning, Their child, a boy with dark hair and lungs full of protest, was born beneath the eaves of that cabin, wrapped in the sound of wind through the pines. Frank held him first, then laid him gently against her chest. Solene looked down at the child, then up at the man beside her. "He's got your eyes. He's got our name," Frank said. She smiled, tired and full. They named him Callum. Years passed and the cabin never emptied. It grew instead, first with a second room, then a porch that wrapped around the side facing the garden. Solene taught Callum how to gather herbs and listen for birdsong. Frank showed him how to split kindling and read the land by its shadows. They never returned to the road behind that saloon. They never had to. There were still hard days, sickness, late frost, the loss of a harvest to rabbits, but none of it touched what they had built. Love had come quietly, but it stayed loud in the way their son laughed. In the creak of the gates, Solene painted every spring. In the way Frank always looked at her as though she were the first and final truth he'd ever known. And when the boy was old enough to ask how they met, Solene would shake her head and say, "That's a story about chains and the man who broke them." Frank would add, "And the woman who taught me how to live again." They grew old there together. The garden spread wide and the trees rose higher each year. The fire never went cold, and in the deep silence of their nights they slept with their hands still laced, like roots grown strong beneath the earth. They never needed more. They had each other, and that was everything.